you all. And tonight's guest also participated in the panel. Tim Raphael is Associate Professor of Arts, Culture, and Media at Rutgers University, Newark. He's the founding director of the Center for Migration and the Global City, which is an incubator for multidisciplinary scholarship, teaching, and civic engagement that supports research, educational curriculum, public humanities programming, and civic partnerships with community and cultural organizations around immigration, which is the topic of tonight's talk, among many other things. Raphael, Tim, can't call him Raphael, we've known each other 20 years. We're babies. We're very young. Is also the co-founder and director of Newest Americans, a multimedia research, documentary, and arts project produced by the Center for Migration and the Global City, and faculty in the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media at Rutgers University, Newark, in partnership with its Seven Photo and Talking Eyes Media. Tim is also a theater director, which is how we met, a producer, a dramaturg, and adapter who has developed more than 50 new American plays, one of which is a play I wrote. We worked on it together, and it's quite related to tonight's subject. He's written extensively on the intersection of politics and performance. He's the author of The President-Elect Ronald Reagan and the Politics of Performance, which examines Reagan's immersion in radio, film, and television as a case study of how the techniques and technologies of electronic media have transformed American politics and political representation. He holds a BA in the history of religions, I didn't know that, from Wesleyan University, and an MA and PhD in performance studies from Northwestern University. He's taught theater, performance studies, and American studies at Rutgers, Dartmouth, Northwestern, Wesleyan, Ursinus, Georgetown University, and the Universidade Aberta in Lisbon, Portugal. Tonight we will talk about newest American stories from the global city. Welcome, Tim. Marvelous.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually been here for 5 days now. I'm having a fabulous time in Beirut and beyond. Could I ask you all a favor? Those of you who are in the back, why don't you come move up a little bit? It's a small crowd. We're going to be showing video throughout. It'll be easier to see. The light will be better. And you're all
if you have to leave, you won't be offended.
No, I won't be offended at all. I may have to leave in the middle of my talk. So what I thought I'd do today, this is a project that has a little bit of a history, and I think I'll very briefly give you some background on the project, and then sort of talk you through what we've been doing in the last 4 years, because I think it's actually instructive and in many ways a replicable project that universities elsewhere have actually now been reaching out to us to explore the possibilities of doing. And what's unique about it? It's a project that brings together a research university, graduate students, faculty, with a documentary production company and 25 of the leading photojournalists in the world. And what it's allowed us to do is a couple of things. One, for those of you who don't work in the media or are not familiar with the situation in the United States, you can't make a living anymore as a professional photographer. It's very, very difficult. It used to be the model was that you built up a body of work and then your work was licensed. People would pay to be able to use your images. That doesn't happen anymore. So people are scrambling, and we have a new media environment in which it's very difficult to get the sort of long-form features paid for by the kinds of media that used to be out there and that currently are either gone or are no longer investing in long-form types of journalism. It's also very difficult these days to be a professional photographer because everybody thinks they're a professional photographer. If you have a smartphone, you are a photographer. So as I was talking to two good friends of mine for the last decade, as the model for how to be a photojournalist in the world was eroding. And to another good friend of mine who works in documentary film, another environment in which, well, there we go, I already made the wrong choice. Another part of the media that's experiencing the kind of chaos of the neoliberal and new economies. We started talking about why it is that the universities don't actually invest in doing this kind of work in a significant way. There are a few places in the US that do. The University of California, Berkeley, with support from Amazon, is now getting a lot of their projects funded as a speculative venture on the part of Amazon, basically for first rights to distribution for the films that they make. Every media company needs content, but nobody's willing to pay generally for the kinds of upfront costs that are required in the kinds of environments in which we work. And so we're very lucky to be able to get some initial seed funding to develop this idea. What happens when you bring together the resources of a research faculty with the skills and experience of kind of an extraordinary group of filmmakers and photographers. And so the reason that we all came together on this project is that I teach at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, which, as you can actually see from this initial image, is about 12 miles from New York City. That's New York City over there, the skyline in the back. We are constantly, as you will hear, in the shadow of New York. Newark is a city that has a really incredibly rich history. It's the 5th oldest city in the United States. But since the mid-1960s, Newark has been a city that's been demonized, vilified as the source of everything that's gone wrong with American cities. Crime, dark-skinned people, lack of a critical infrastructure, a dying old world economy. And for those of us who work in Newark and care about the city, we don't see the same city that the media portrays in the United States. It's portrayed as a city that is all about black and white. It's not. It's one of the most diverse cities in the United States. It is, in fact, as we argue, a global city. Global city is a term, for those of you who are not familiar, it's actually an academic term that comes into practice largely in the 1990s to describe certain types of new emerging cities that are financial centers, global financial centers. This does not describe Newark, but I make the argument, and I've made this argument in writing as well as verbally, that to understand what a global city is in the United States, we have to stop thinking about it simply as a financial center. We need to understand that increasingly American cities are global cities. That is, they're cities where, like much of the rest of the country will be in 30 to 40 years, there is no ethnic majority. To put it in plain terms, white people are no longer the majority in most of these post-industrial cities in the United States like Newark. Demographers tell us that within 30 years or so, the United States will be in the same situation. There will be no ethnic majority in the United States. I teach at a campus that has been described by U.S. News and World Report, which sort of ranks colleges and universities in the United States as the most diverse city in the as the most diverse campus in the United States for the last 2 decades. So in some ways we have a crystal ball into the future on our campus. And there's a lot of conversation about the most diverse campus in the United States. Students are tired of hearing it. It's out in the promotional materials, they hear it the first day they arrive. But what does that really mean, and what are the implications? And that's sort of what this project has been about exploring. So we are a storytelling and documentary project, and the stories that we tell and the lives that we document, the histories that we document, are those of our students and the communities that they come from. We're privileged to have access to students from almost 130 countries in the world. So we have insight into what the newest Americans, who they are, what their experiences, and also to the sending context of their countries. Because unlike the old model of immigration in the United States, which was the melting pot idea that people came from somewhere else and they stayed and they seamlessly blended into the melting pot of American culture, a narrative that was never true, but was one that was, became the sort of dominant narrative of immigration in the United States. These immigrant communities, these newest Americans, don't come to the United States and stay. They stay and go back, they come back again, they create networks in multiple countries. Many of my students have family in 4, 5, 6 countries. They move between them, they move through various worlds virtually, right? Check a Facebook page of one of my students and you'll see 15 or 20 countries popping up on the addresses. But they also move between them often actually physically. So it's a different world than the world that immigration historians in the United States generally describe. Immigration to the United States, if you go to any United States high school and you graduate, you are likely, if you have even had a class at all about immigration, you are likely to believe that immigration to the United States ends with the closing of Ellis Island in 1954. There is nothing that is taught in the vast majority of schools in the United States about immigration beyond that moment. And there's a law that comes into play in 1965 that Lyndon Johnson enacts, which is an Immigration and Naturalization Act, which for the first time in the history of the United States opens the country up to people from all over the world. Until that point, it was almost impossible, unless you were basically coming as slave labor, to come from a non-European country. And that changes in 1965. And it's instructive that Lyndon Johnson, at the time that he enacts this law in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, is where he signed it, denies to everyone in attendance that this law will make any difference whatsoever in the United States. In fact, he has a remarkable statement where he literally says, don't worry about what we're doing now. It won't affect anybody. Nothing will change. It won't have any impact. He was lying, or he was wrong. One can decide which. He was dead wrong, really. The United States has changed dramatically because of that particular law. And you see it on the campus that I teach all the time, but you see it all over now. And so one of the things in this particular political moment, when the one party in the election basically used immigration as their primary issue for why they should be supported, was about the danger that in immigration and these post-1965 immigrants pose to the social and cultural fabric of the United States. And it's not actually that surprising that that would be an effective strategy in certain parts of the country, especially when you understand that most people who go to school in the United States never get taught or introduced to the people who've arrived since 1965. So that's what we are trying to do with this project. We're a media project. We make films, we make photo essays, we make podcasts, we do short nonfiction, we do short fiction, we do basically any kind of media that you can create in a university environment where you have artists and fiction writers and scholars and filmmakers. And we do so largely because we're trying to meet our target audience where they live. The project is largely geared towards young people, although we've been very happy that people over the age of 30 or so actually watch and read and enjoy the project. But really, it's about a target audience that's much younger. I haven't given up entirely on people over the age of 30 or 35, but I have for the most part when it comes to politics, when it comes to a variety of different things. I'm more interested in what the next generation is going to do with the fact that they live in the most multicultural society in the history of the world. And so that's really what is the impetus behind the project. It's astonishing how little media there actually is that engages with these stories and with these histories. And so in addition to creating the media that we've created over the last 4.5, 5 years, we're now creating curriculum from that media, precisely because there is such a lack of curriculum in high schools and earlier. And we're trying to develop this project in a way that also allows us to be consultants to other universities that are looking to do similar kinds of work. We're doing a project right now in Colombia, we're doing one in Malta, we have a couple of the universities in the US where we're consulting on similar projects. And we're hoping that this is a model for a certain kind of blending of scholarship, media creation, storytelling, etc. So anyway, these are the stories from the global city. And yeah.
Before you go to media, can you just, for people who don't know, just paraphrase in short form what the 1965 law was, because it marks it before and after, so what the shift was?
I can. So prior to the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, there were quotas, immigration quotas, which were very, very strict and which were very, very narrowly defined, and which meant essentially that only people of Western European lineage and extraction could come to the United States, except in certain circumstances. The bracero workers from Mexico could come and basically work as slave labor for periods of time. There were other exceptions. Universities were one place where you could have people from different countries come because of special skills that were not in abundance in the U.S. What the Immigration and Naturalization Act did, I don't want to go into the weeds on this. I mean, it basically opens up the rest of the world. It means that there are a certain number of people from different quadrants of the world that would be accepted in a variety of different ways. There are 3 different types of visas one can get. There are 3 different ways that you can stay. There were paths to citizenship that were sort of opened up in 1965. I don't want to go into the weeds because it's complicated, and there will be an exception to anything that I could say, and somebody will call me out on it. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that.
But the point is that this is this mark, a prior and after, and the current administration is trying to return it to before.
Yes, and I don't want to go too deep into that either, because we get off into politics at the moment. I will, as I did on Monday, go off a little bit, and I don't want to. I'd rather focus on the project. Yes, but
I'm
in
just
fact,
saying it's prescient and important right now.
sure. So there is no doubt that we have an administration in place in the United States that is trying to roll back immigration law in all sorts of ways, and that is attempting to shut down our borders.
Other immigration countries tax the same, mainly focusing on Europeans, but the Netherlands were so smart in Australia to become classified as honorary Europeans.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the project is, as I suggested, multivarious. There are lots of different things that we do. I'll play you a very short sort of teaser, which gives you a sense of the range of it. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which we work with the research that's provided by faculty and students and develop that into other types of media. So, yeah, we could kill that. It'd be wonderful.
We're in the shadows of New York. The thing with the New York City is there's so much good talent. It just needs to be recognized. I'm an immigrant, I'm an artist, an organizer, and an instigator.
A lot of their fans don't have cars, they don't have phones, they don't have all these basic things. What's the point?
And my homeland. And my homeland is me. My love for you is fire in my heart. When am I going to see you free?
Every time I said I'm going to stop, I can't.
Whenever somebody uses the word illegal, they're actively dehumanizing a person.
Well, North was, let's say North was a place of energy. If you come from someplace else, you're going to stop in North first.
For most of my childhood, my father was all over the world, traveling, speaking, writing poetry, doing plays. Their grandson is now the mayor of the city.
My family is from Pakistan,
Egypt,
Puerto Rico.
India, Nepal.
I'm the first one in the family to be born in America.
So as you can see from that very short clip, we do a lot of work around the arts, largely because most of us working on the project are in some ways involved in the arts, or at least think of ourselves as storytellers. It's a cultural project, much more than it is a political project. We're also not trying to create legislative work, research that is going into trying to change legislation. We're after hearts and minds. And so we are looking at immigrant communities both in Newark and the vicinity, but also sending context. A couple of the clips you saw there, we made a film. There's a large number of Guatemalan immigrants who live in the Newark region. In fact, there's a pipeline between a very small town in the Western Highlands and a town called Morristown, right near Newark. 7,000 men between the ages of 18 and 45, which is 70% of the male population of that age, in the town of Kapolei in the Western Highlands, lives in Morristown, New Jersey. Why? Because you can't make a living in Kapolei. And it's part of the reason we have the migrant caravan, quote unquote, heading towards the United States border, is because there are parts of Central America where, either because of gang violence or because of political oppression or because of lack of a way to make a living, people need to go someplace else. So we're looking at those kinds of stories. We're looking at the stories of the people who are now emerging as the next sort of artistic and cultural voices in the United States, many of whom are students on our campus. And we're trying to understand what are the issues, what are the opportunities, what's at stake as we move towards becoming a majority-minority country, right? A country with no one ethnic group that will be the majority. So how do we begin? What kind of work do we do? One of the things that we believe in really strongly is that archives are important. And that for too many years, the only purpose of archives has been for academic research. We feel like archives are way too important to leave in the hands only of academics. No offense to anybody who's an academic, but they have purpose and interest and importance well beyond that. So 10 years ago, I started working. A graduate student of mine found a shoebox, 3 shoeboxes actually, on the back shelves of the Newark Public Library. And in those shoeboxes were microcassettes. Most of you will have never seen a microcassette. Older than 35 or 40, you might have seen a microcassette, on which were over 125 interviews with African Americans who moved to Newark during the Great Migration. A period from approximately 1910 to 1970, which saw the largest internal migration in the history of the United States. These were largely African Americans living under Jim Crow in the South. The Jim Crow laws were laws that kept African Americans in a secondary form of bondage or slavery. The largest internal migration in the history of the US brought many of them up to urban cities in the north, like Newark. And these were interviews that were astonishing. And that had been sitting on these shelves for over 20 years, and nobody had listened to them, nobody had documented them, they weren't cataloged, they weren't archived. So we digitized them, we cataloged them, we archived them, and we created a website. Provided access to all of the original audio, and then we started to make media from those oral histories. And I'm going to talk through a few of the different ways that we did that. Just really quickly about North Americans. This is the basic description of the project, which I've mentioned. We call the project a collaboratory. It's a collaborative laboratory. Journalists, artists, faculty, and students. What we've discovered, and it's something worth thinking about in any university, and whenever I talk about the project at a university, I say, ask in the room, how many members of the faculty, how many graduate students would like to have a larger audience for their work than the 200 to 2,000 people who generally read the journals that they publish in? And usually people respond affirmatively. Yes, we would like more people to know about our work. Yes, we would like more people to be aware of what we do. That's part of what the project does. We have faculty on our campus who do remarkable work. That is recognized as remarkable work by the 200 to 2,000 people who read the journals that we publish it. And so we've been trying to find ways to actually get that work out and circulating, important work out and circulating to a larger audience. That's why we started to work in these archives. We also importantly, just want to mention the last point here, which is the project is hyper-local. We're really focused on Newark, New Jersey and its environs. But we do so with the full knowledge that these stories are stories that have national and global implications, which is why we're now beginning to work outside the US and trying to tell the stories from the sending context as well. As I said, we have a project going on in Malta now, another project in Colombia, and we're really excited about the ways in which we're now able to sort of tell stories across borders. So, as Robert mentioned, these are the three partners, 7 photos, VII, Roman numeral 7, 25 photojournalists from all around the world who between them have basically covered every crisis zone in the world for the last 25 years. So they know the context from which all of our students come, and they have access to media, to images that we use to put these stories that are local stories in dialogue with. Talking Eyes is a social documentary production company. They are a media production house. Terrific company, actually did a fabulous film about the Syrian refugees called Syria's Lost Generation, which you certainly ought to check out if you were interested in such topics. And then Rutgers University in Newark, which is where I teach. So this was the website for the Kruger Scott Oral History Collection, 125 plus interviews that we digitized, cataloged, archived, and put up online. But it's not enough just to throw them online. Who's going to pay attention? Who's going to go listen? Why should anybody care? So we began to develop media from these projects. It's very hard to read at this distance, but there are 6 different ways in which we develop media from this project. We Came and Stayed is a short film that we made because in this collection, we discovered there was an interview with Coit Jones. Coit Jones is a fascinating person unto himself. He arrives in Newark in 1927 from rural South Carolina, sort of lives the American dream. He becomes a middle class, he gets a job at the post office. It's a union job, it's a good, steady job, becomes a middle class Newarker, and has two children, one of whom he names Leroy Jones, who people in the United States and maybe even here know better as Amiri Baraka. Probably the most, if not the most important, at least best known African-American poet, playwright, activist from the 1960s through the 1990s. He became the Poet Laureate of New Jersey. He has been both adored and vilified by many. His son, who is named Raz Baraka, becomes the current mayor of Newark. So in 2 generations, you go from the rural South to a sort of legendary figure in African-American cultural life to the mayor of a city that when Coit Jones arrived, didn't let black people live in most parts of the city. So you have an incredible story there that's told both in the interview and because we were able to get access to Raz Baraka, who had just become mayor at the time, we get him answering many of the same questions that were posed to his grandfather 20 years previously for this oral history project. At the time that we did the film, Raz Baraka wasn't giving interviews to the media because his predecessor, Cory Booker, some of you may have heard of him, he's now the US Senator from New Jersey. He will likely be a presidential candidate in 2020. Cory Booker had been the mayor of Newark prior to Raz Baraka, and Cory Booker did nothing but give interviews. He's somebody who is remarkably charismatic, very smart. He did some wonderful things in the city of Newark, but most Newarkers thought of him as not somebody of Newark. He was rarely there. He was there for a media opportunity. There's a great story where he jumps into a fire and saves a kid from a fire. He had a gift for high-profile media events. Raz, who was from Newark, unlike Cory, who wasn't, really ran as an anti-Cory Booker. He ran as somebody who was there for Newark, wasn't interested in being part of the national media, didn't want Newark to be part of this national conversation in which Newark always was portrayed badly. So he wasn't giving interviews to anybody. He gave interviews to us for two reasons. One, we were also of Newark. We are there. The university's in Newark. We had somebody on our staff who was very close to his family, who he agreed to speak with. And he agreed to let the photographer that we work with be embedded with him because Ashley Gilbertson, the photographer, had just done a feature for Time magazine embedded for 3 days with then President Barack Obama. And that actually had a significant impact on our ability to do the story. I'm going to show you the film in just a minute because it's, again, it's indicative of the way that we sort of have done this project, a combination of research and media brought together in some ways to tell stories that have not been told or are not told at any great length. Why, you might ask, with a project about post-1965 immigration, are we doing a story about an African-American family? One of the arguments that we make in the project, and it's one of the things that's sort of central to the identity of the project because of where it is in Newark, New Jersey, which is an African-American city and has been a largely African-American city since the 1960s, is because of another interview that we came across in this collection. And it was an interview by another former mayor of Newark, again, legendary mayor, or one could describe him in all sorts of ways. He's one of the great American scoundrels, and I happen to think very highly of him because he's a colorful figure and he's sort of a classic American mayor. His name is Sharp James, and he gave a 3-hour interview. Sharp could never talk for less than 3 hours. If you asked him a question, that's how long he would give you as the answer. But in the 3-hour interview, he said something quite remarkable, describing his arrival in Newark as part of the Great Migration from the rural South, in his case, Florida. He said, coming to Newark from rural Florida, I was as much a stranger in a strange land as any Eastern European Jew who arrived on these shores. He literally compared his journey to the classic American journey of immigrant Jews and Eastern Europeans coming to New York, getting off at Ellis Island and living that particular narrative. He said there was no difference. And in many ways, it's understandable. The difference between rural Florida and Newark, New Jersey in the 1950s when Sharp James arrived is what was probably as great as the difference between, Odessa and New York City in the early 20th century when most Eastern European Jews began arriving. And this idea that because African Americans migrated within the national boundaries, it was somehow fundamentally a different type of migration, was one that struck us as very odd. And in fact, there's a scholar who's on the faculty who we work with quite a bit, who's been writing about this for a while, that it's imperative to understand the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North in the same terms that we understand the migration from Eastern Europe of the Jews in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were both fleeing pogroms of a kind. They were both looking for a place in which they were able to fully exercise their potential to live, to work, housing, etc. All the same issues really compelled Southern blacks to come to the Northeast of the United States as the pogroms did in Eastern Europe. So, and because of where the project is located, because it's a largely African American city that is now becoming an incredibly diverse global city, this seemed an important story to tell. And so we spent a lot of time making those connections in the piece. The second thing you really can't read up there is another project that we did, which is called the Glass Book Project, which was a project using the oral histories from the collection and working with students and 2 artists to create books made of glass. Why books made of glass? Part of another faculty member's project, which he had started to understand and represent certain kinds of trauma. He had done 5 or 6 collections at that point, working with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, working with women who were victims of domestic violence, working with a whole range of people who had experienced trauma, and trying to express their experience through these books made of glass. Why glass? Glass is both incredibly fragile and also something that's very resilient. It's something that you can see through, but it can also obscure. It's something that actually has proved to be an incredibly powerful medium for telling these kinds of stories. The work that this friend of mine has done, this other colleague of mine at Rutgers, has been seen in the White House. I think the collections are now in 30 state historical museums around the country. And so we took advantage of what had struck me as a brilliant concept, and we asked if we could do a collection that looked at the trauma of displacement, the trauma of migration. And so we did this project with a group of our students. We exhibited the project at a local gallery. It got some attention, so we moved it to the Newark Museum. Got some attention there, so it went to the State House. So this sort of small class that developed this project ultimately got 3 exhibitions. We made a short film about it, and we told the stories of the people whose interviews were used in the project. And so those stories got out to a larger audience in that way. The third item up there that you can't really see is a piece called Over My Dead Body, which is taken from another one of the oral histories by a woman named Louise Epperson, who was a physical therapist, the first African-American physical therapist in the state of New Jersey, who was on the verge of retiring in 1967, when on January 1st, the cover of the Newark newspaper told of a plan to bring a medical school to the city of Newark. And they were going to build a medical school in her neighborhood. And in fact, they were going to take her house to do that. How do you take somebody's house away from them to build a medical school? It's the 1960s. All you have to do if you are a member of city government is to blight the land. Declare that that land is uninhabitable, seize it by eminent domain, pay the person almost nothing, and move them somewhere else. And you can seize the land to give it to a medical school. Louise Epperson, however, was already an activist, and she decided she was going to fight. So she went around to all her neighbors and said, we can't let this happen. She went to bars. She went to strip clubs. In fact, I don't know if that translates, strip club, where women go and, yeah, you all understand what a strip club is, yeah? Back in the 1960s, they used to have cages in which women would dance. Go-go cages was what they were called. Louise Epperson, at 67 years old, got up into the go-go cage when the dancers would take their break. And she would say, I can't shake it like they do, but I need to shake up your mind. She literally said this, I need to shake up your mind. And she started talking to them about the seizure of this land by eminent domain and recruited them to join her in this fight. Her story is an incredible story, and she tells it in this oral history. So we had a graduate student of ours who was working on these oral histories as her PhD dissertation in American Studies. And she wrote a piece for the Newest Americans magazine, which I'm going to show you in a moment, which is where we publish a lot of our work. She wrote a story in which she told the story of Louise Epperson in dialogue with Louise Epperson. So the story reads, with Katie's writing interspersed with sound bites, audio clips of Louise Epperson. So it's a dialogic piece that she's written, partially with writing, partially with audio. So it's another form that we began to experiment with. How do we use these clips in conversation with scholarly writing, right? Another piece in there is called Collard Greens All Year Long, where another graduate student in American Studies noted all of the stories in these 125 accounts, all these stories about food and the importance of food in migration. When did you first start to feel like you were at home in Newark? When I could find collard greens. How did you get to Newark? Well, I came by train. What do you remember about the train ride? Well, I remember that we had to pack shoeboxes when we got on the train in North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida. Why did you have to pack shoeboxes? Well, because many of the states that we were passing through wouldn't serve us food. So we had to pack all of our food, and we packed it up in shoeboxes. So we ultimately created the glass books exhibit inside shoeboxes as a way to sort of pay tribute to this particular reality of migration for African Americans who came to Newark. So this graduate student of ours wrote a really fabulous piece about foodways and what you can find out through this collection of interviews about foodways, what they were in the rural South, how they changed in the North, what kind of cultural knowledge is transmitted and transferred through food. And then finally, we mounted a exhibition called We Found Our Way, Newark Portraits from the Great Migration, building off of the interviews, building off of the oral histories, combining it with an incredible collection that the Newark Public Library has of African American art, and working with the Newark Historical Society to take some of their resources and blend them all together to create this exhibit. So exhibition, audio stories, video, writing, books made of glass, trying to figure out what are the different ways that you can tell these stories, what are the different audiences that you can get to if you tell these stories in these different media. So that was basically the idea of this project, and it became a model for the kind of work that we do. We rarely tell a particular story in one medium or one form. We create story packages, and I'm going to try, Vanessa taught me well enough, try to go from here to here. Yeah, hey, you guys love that. It kind of works. Don't do that. Hit play. Hit play. Where is it? Almost had it. Okay. So this is the magazine, and we decided from the beginning that we were going to put out a digital multimedia magazine twice a year. And this would be the place where we would take the best work that we were creating, student work, faculty work, professional media, etc. And this is where we would publish it twice a year. The magazine, like the project, is called Newest Americans. This is our first issue. That's a photograph by Ashley Gilbertson, who I mentioned, of Raz Baraka, the mayor of Newark, talking to our Marcia Brown, answering some of the same questions that his grandfather, Quick Jones, answered 20 years prior. In this first issue, we had a little bit of editorializing by me. We have this film, We Came and Stayed, which I will show you in 1 second, which is accompanied by a photo essay by Ashley Gilbertson. So film and photo essay. From Where I Stand. So another thing that we did is we decided we wanted to work with the journalism faculty, who was very excited about this project because it was an opportunity for their students to have the real world experience, and to develop a particular project with them, because again, they're as diverse as the rest of the campus. So we worked in a narrative class with them, and they developed this concept, actually, taking a single prompt, From Where I Stand. That was the assignment. They had to develop over the course of 3 assignments a 3 to 5 minute audio essay, a narrative based on this prompt, From Where I Stand. That's all all they had to respond to. But the idea was that we would take this incredibly diverse group of students, and they would share their experiences in some way based on this prompt. So in the first issue we had, this is a Nigerian girl here, it's a remarkable piece. There's 3 other pieces in that issue. And we've done this every issue. This has become an ongoing series. Basically, From Where I Stand, stories from the local city. We had our first glass book project piece, which again built off the same oral histories as the film and the photo essay. I have a student. We have a lot of students on our campus who are undocumented. They're students largely from Mexico and Central America, who were brought to the United States when they were very young by their parents. They are known as dreamers at this point. It's hard to know exactly how many there are in the United States, but their existence in the United States is precarious. Barack Obama, when he was president, passed a law. He didn't pass a law. He issued a presidential, what's the word?
Executive order?
Sorry?
Executive order?
Executive order, thank you. That enabled dreamers, people who were brought here before a certain moment in time, before a certain age, who've been living in the United States for a certain period of time, to have temporary status in the United States so that they didn't have to spend every day worrying about whether they were going to be sent back to wherever they were from. This they still, to this day, this was done 3 years ago, to this day they still have that temporary precarious status. There is, we have a Congress that doesn't seem to be able to agree that children who were brought over at 1, 2, and 3 years old didn't commit an act that was illegal, and that they don't have a right, having known only this country and no other, to this country, the United States, that they don't have a right to be there. So we decided the day that Obama signed DACA, that we were going to follow one student and her family's experience until DACA had worked its way through the courts until some kind of a resolution to this. It's been 6 issues so far, 6 different. We created a web series, so there have been 6 webisodes, and there still is no resolution. In that time, Marisol Conde Hernandez, who's a student who we followed, started law school, finished law school, graduated from law school, passed the bar, and became the first undocumented person in New Jersey to become a lawyer in the state of New Jersey, because currently, if you were undocumented, you do not have the right to become a lawyer in the United States, unless you were in a state where the state bar, which has to decide who gets to be a lawyer, decides they're going to make an exception for you. They've made an exception for Marisol, and as of 2 weeks ago, I am incredibly proud to say she is a member of the New Jersey State Bar. Marisol is an incredibly inspirational figure. I won't say much more about her except to say that when I introduced my daughter to her, I said, this is who you, I'm sorry, I get very emotional when I think about her. This is who you need to grow up and become. She's remarkable. We had a young Asian student from a number of different countries in Asia who decided that he was going to create a graphic novel about what it was like for him to arrive in Newark from suburban New Jersey after being told by his parents and everyone in his community, you don't want to go to school in Newark, but if you have to go there, you arrive on the train, you walk straight to the campus, you take your classes, you walk straight back, do not look right, do not look left, do not go anywhere else in that dangerous city, and you go home. Well, Alex, after a year of that, decided he wanted to go out and explore a little bit more, and he all of a sudden became fascinated by the city. He now lives in Newark. But this was his story about what it was like to be a young Asian kid told that you don't want to go to, you need to keep your distance from those people in Newark. And who, based on his experience at Rutgers, based on his experience in the city, decided that there was a different world out there. And anyway, so this was a graphic novel that we did 3 installments of in the first 3 issues. And then finally, Notes for My Homeland. Well, not finally, because there's one more. Notes for My Homeland, which I actually think I'm going to show. You know, I'm going to hold a vote, because we don't have that much time. Notes for My Homeland came out of, as most of our stories do, came out of one of our students' experience. This was a student of mine who was working on a PhD in American Studies. He already had an advanced degree in the oud from the University of Damascus. He's a world-class oud player. He's a phenomenal musician. He was left Syria in the early 2000s and came to get his PhD in American Studies because he had created basically the largest collection in the world of recordings of Wasla music. I did not know what Wasla music was. There are probably more folks in the room who do. It's classical Arabic music. He was from Aleppo in Syria, which is in many ways the most important place for the collecting and maintaining of classical Arabic music traditions. His house in Aleppo had a library, a musical library of Wasla music that was larger than any library in Syria. And when it was completely destroyed in the bombing a year and a half ago, turned into rubble, that amazing collection disappeared with it. So he decided he was going to pair up with an old friend of his, who was a composer, Syrian composer, and create a series of concerts to raise money for Syrian children, which started 4 years ago, and he's now playing these concerts all around the world. They've raised many millions of dollars. It's kind of an inspirational project. But again, we didn't do this. We did this because this was one of our students, and this was somebody whose story came out of our campus, and who knew, right? That we were connected to the rest of the world in this way. And then finally, the last, oh no, there's more. She's not forgot this big issue. This was another student of mine, a student from Honduras who did 2 tours of duty in Iraq as a way to pay his way through college, as many of our students do. Many of our students, the only way they can afford to go to school is to be in the reserves. In the United States, if you're in the military reserves, you can get your education largely paid for. That's the good side. The downside is if the country happens to be in a war, you can be called up at any time. And he was called up twice and spent time in Iraq. He's also a spoken word artist and an actor, and he wrote this fabulous piece called Transcendental Latino, which not only appeared in this issue, but every time we do a performance around newest Americans, which we do quite often in the tri-state area in New York, he always comes out and reads because he's a phenomenal performer as well. And then finally, the last piece in the first issue is a ongoing series called Made in the USA, done by a doctoral student who now has her PhD. She's a historian of domestic labor in the United States. Domestic labor, for those of you who don't know in the United States, was for many years largely a workforce composed of African American women. Today, it's largely immigrant women. And so she writes both professionally and for newest Americans around these issues. What are the kinds of stories that come up that tell stories of America, stories of the United States, through domestic labor? Again, this is a storytelling project. None of the work that we do are sort of classic academic research work, although she is a domestic labor scholar. She uses this forum as a way to tell the stories that she can't find a way to tell in her scholarship, which is more interested in telling in narrative and in storytelling. So that's the kind of work that we do, and now you get to vote. You want to see the story about the Jones-Baraka family and their arrival in Newark and Raz Baraka becoming the mayor of Newark, or do you want to see the film Notes from My Homeland, which is about the Syrian-American composer who actually composed the first chant that Syrian students used when they spilled out in the streets in protest 7 years ago now, I guess. So quick vote. Who wants to see Notes for My Homeland? 2, 3, 4, 5. Who wants to see Raz Baraka? Oh my goodness, it's not him. Yeah, 5. All right, so wait, how much time, Robert, do we have? There are other things I was going to show you, but if you want to see, I can show you these two. Again, they're very short. These films are 40 minutes.
Why don't we see both of them, and then, we've already had a little discussion, and then we'll have a question or two, and if people can stay, we'll, enjoy that. If they have to leave, they'll leave, but yeah, let's see them both.
Sounds good. All right. I just have to see why it's not clicking on. So if it's in full screen, I wonder if you can't do it. I'm going to find out. We were having some problems before. It should, yeah, it'll go. It's just a slow connection, I think. There you go. So let's kill the lights.
It's also possible the electricity will go out. The
Yes.
thing's not
Well, I'm hoping it will. I'd be surprised. One of the things. So that's what I'm doing. One of the things about that allowed us to do this was that we had access to Malak Shamdali because of my student, Mohammed Al-Said. Because Malik trusted us to tell the story, he gave us the security footage from his home when his parents were beaten, and he gave us all of that footage from the streets of Syria that he collected from people who were in Homs, which is where he's from, and they sent it over so that we can use it. Very little of the footage in there is available generally. It's stuff that was sent, which is why you have all the different film stocks, which is why you have sort of different quality of footage. We decided early on that we wanted it to feel like it was pieced together by lots of different people who had been witnesses to the events. We had lots of conversations about how bloody it was. There was a lot of talk about how, I still think there's probably too much in there, but it felt necessary because so much of the footage that we were sent, that's what was being shown. It's also, I think, just a remarkable story about the importance of music and the way in which music has the kind of impact that would enrage a dictator to the extent that they would go and beat the parents of a composer. But the music also was able to inspire students to get out into the street and sing and chant and resist. So yeah, that actually was the first film that we made, and still in many ways I see it every time. It's hard to watch. I find it very hard to watch, but I'm also very proud that we did it. So that film got us some attention, which was helpful to the project because it helped us raise some money. The Atlantic picked it up, put it on their website. The New York Times picked it up and sent it out on their site. The Atlantic ultimately gives our own webpage, so we began to feed stories through the Atlantic, which was very helpful because again, although we were a hyper-local project and we wanted to remain that way, we needed funding to do the work, so it was helpful to get it out to a larger national audience. And as you can see from here, we've now done 6 issues. We have our next issue is coming out December 6th. So watch for it. And we've been trying to do 2 issues a year with anywhere from 6 to 8 stories. I'm going to show you, just because I talked so much about the Jones and Baraka family, I want to show that to, again, it's a short piece. One of my favorites, just because I'm very close to the family at this point, and I've become a huge admirer of Raz Baraka. It's a very difficult job to be the mayor of Newark, especially at a time when there are a lot of people lurking. Development money is pouring into Newark. It's seen as a good investment. All of a sudden, he's walking a kind of really difficult tightrope between looking out for folks in the city and trying to take advantage of the fact that there's an interest in investing in the city right now. And I think he's done a remarkable job. He was so enamored with this piece. I was very proud. I was terrified of what he was going to think when we did the piece. He thankfully liked the piece enough that he instantly posted it to his Facebook page. And as we know in this era, if you post something to your Facebook page, it means that you're in love. So that was what it was. It is still resolving. Actually, no, I think that's straight to here. I probably won't go any faster. While that's queuing up, just to show you some of the remarkable photographs, because again, this is a project that is ultimately a visual project. So Ashley Gilbertson is a remarkable photographer, and as you can see, he sort of got the shot. This was Raz Baraka's initial first address as the mayor of Newark. You can see the look on the face of, for one quick sec, just show, just because again, as for photographers, if any of you are photographers, he gets everybody here in an incredibly telling moment. The woman over here is clearly in love with Raz. The hand right there. This guy over here is checking his phone because he's already on to his next gig, whatever it is. The applause, the handshake, and there's Raz haloed with a lighted back. It's just a beautiful photograph, and Ashley's a remarkable photographer. This is one of my favorite shots from the photo essay because on the right is Cory Booker. In the middle is Raz. Raz hates Cory Booker. I mean hates him. This is the only time I've ever seen them together where Raz wasn't giving him a sidelong glance, like, if you get closer to me, you will catch my hand. But it's a lovely shot, and again, just a very unusual one. You won't see that too many other places. And this one I love too. This was at an event in the Ironbound section of Newark. Raz is genuinely somebody who gets out in the streets, and people love him. This woman just walked up to him and threw her arms around him and actually got the shot. Raz, unlike most politicians, isn't sort of either trying to get away real quick or whatever. He actually seems to enjoy human contact, which is, a rarity. Let me see if we can get to the film this way. I think we can.
I came to Newark
27, 1927.
How did you travel? Train.
Train. My grandfather migrated here from the South, like most African American families in this country. My father would make a joke and say his family was trying to find New York, and they said Newark, and they got off the train thinking it was New York City. No, it was an act of history. Your grandson is now the mayor of the city, and it's a great opportunity to be in the seat of power now because you get to paint on a canvas the way you think things should appear.
When I came, I hailed a taxi. The one thing I can remember about that ride was the amount of people that crossed the street at Rowan Market. I had never seen that many people before. I asked the taxi driver if there was a fire or something like that.
Childhood, that scene where his father is there typing away and there's a little boy in the background at the table. That's Raz and his dad at home. That photograph of Raz with a picket sign at like 6 years old saying "Free Amiri Baraka." That's a picture from their family album. So it's kind of amazing that we weren't sure he was actually going to share any footage with us, and we kept sort of asking and then like waiting a few weeks, and we'd ask again, and one day his cousin shows up at our office, and again, I swear to God, he had a shoebox. Shoebox is a recurring theme, with all sorts of stuff in it. Just gave it to us. He said, "Make sure you get it back." All he said, and turned around and laughed. I'm like, okay. It's great because we have like footage that doesn't exist anywhere else, which is, again, makes it feel like we're actually inside the family home. Is that beeping because?
Yeah,
Just
since the
doing
electricity
it.
hasn't returned.
Oh, it hasn't returned. Okay, so that's fine. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts or beeps.
Are you working with other campuses? I mean, are you trying to make this something that happens on other campuses as well?
So I started going out and talking about this project about a year after we began doing it, and there are a couple of places that every time I've gone somewhere, somebody has said, "Can we do this? How do we do this? Let's talk." So I've been to the University of Michigan at Dearborn, which is a really diverse campus. In fact, it's the largest number of Muslim students, I think, in the country. They're now developing a version of this. We've been working with people at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. We've been working with
Colombia?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about these collaborations that you do outside of the U.S. and under what kind of rubric does it take place? Is it still a Newest Americans project?
So-
Is it like
so-
people who have been in America?
It's a great question,
like,
yeah.
know?
So the Columbia project is because there was a faculty member from Universidad de los Andes who was doing a Fulbright in Newark, and she saw the Newest Americans work, and she had just started a project that roughly translates from the Spanish as Histories for the Future, which is a peace-building project that she started with another historian at the largest public university in the country. And they and their students are gathering stories and creating podcasts and creating an archive of 60 years of the violence as a way to sort of move to the next stage. And one of her arguments was that the memory work that's being done in Colombia, and there's a lot of it, is all focused on the past. It's all focused on kind of digging into the trauma of the past, but almost nobody's doing anything to tell stories that can move the country forward. And she thought the kinds of methods that we've been using, the kinds of stories would work there. So she got funding for us to go over, meet with a bunch of members of the project, and develop a storytelling workshop, which we went back and did 4 months later, filmed it, did interviews, did some mapping work, because we do a lot of mapping around this project as well. And we're waiting right now, the Truth Commission, which was formed shortly after the peace accords with the FARC in Colombia, has a 3-year mandate to do their work and then make a recommendation to the government as to how they should move forward. And we think, we're keeping our fingers crossed, we should know in the next 3 weeks, we think we're gonna have a contract from the Peace Commission to do this kind of work there with our partners in Bogota. And the reason there's a connection is A, we want to share, because we think these are methods that can be used at a lot of different universities for a lot of different types of projects. But also, we have a lot of Colombian students at Rutgers. And it turns out that one of our students, she got her law degree 2 years ago, is the daughter of Carlos Urán, who was one of the Supreme Court justices who was killed in 1985 in the siege of the Supreme Court, which is one of the bloodiest events in 60 years of violence, and is still the event that people, when you bring up kind of how do we get past this moment, they still bring that up and say, we will never get past it until we get justice for what happened in the siege. Because what essentially happened is the military took over the operation from the from the politicians and the government and just stormed the Supreme Court where another group, not the FARC, had taken hostages. And they actually went in not so much, they wanted to kill the terrorist group, but they also, they wanted to kill the group that had taken the Supreme Court justices hostage. They also wanted to kill the Supreme Court justices because they were much more liberal than the military was. And it was an easy way for them to knock off, it turns out, 12 different justices in this bloody assault on the Supreme Court. And the guy who led the military assault, this was 1985, the guy who led that assault lives today just outside of Miami. Yeah. Yeah. So again, these are wounds that require a great deal to heal. But
He's an immigrant, right? He's
He is.
kind of American immigrant.
Indeed, he is.
Yeah, well, you talk about Malta too. The Malta story is really a fascinating one of going global.
Yeah, so this is a project that started because again, another graduate student of mine, Palestinian student who was born in just outside of Beirut, actually, in one of the resettlement camps. Her grandparents were sent there in 1948. Both of her parents were born in the camp, grew up in the camp. She was born in. Ended up at the University of Malta getting her degree. While she was there, met a bunch of refugees, because Malta is a really important spot, as most of you know, for North African refugees who can't get to the European continent. A lot of them end up in Malta, halfway across the Mediterranean. And she started what I believe is still the only refugee youth NGO in the world, a group called Spark 15. And because she was my graduate student and because she told me this incredible story about what they had done, and that they were trying to start a media wing because they've had a very hard time because the Maltese government for many years, their stance was that they're not refugees who are going to settle here, so we don't have to develop any kind of an integration strategy. They're going to be resettled elsewhere, even though, as Brexit happens and as Trump happens, there's no place to go. Spark 15 was founded really to try and advocate for the refugees who were there, who weren't getting access to higher education, who weren't getting access to decent jobs and living conditions. And Spark 15 was recognized by the UN, is now negotiating with the Maltese government. The government was given an ultimatum last year by the EU, basically saying if you don't develop an integration strategy, we're going to stop funding it. So they hastily put together this integration strategy, which Spark 15 is now a primary advisor on. So it's a remarkable story. So we're going over there. I've been there once, going back with a number of members of our team in May and June to go do these workshops with Spark 15 to help to increase their capacity to create media and tell their stories, and to do a documentary on them as well. So these kinds of opportunities happen because of where our students come from, right? There's another project that may happen in a township outside of Pretoria in South Africa, again because of another student. And the University of Pretoria, which has a campus right on the outskirts of the township, and is doing some amazing work in trying to really sort of not only do research on the township, but actually provide capacity and resources. And so we're trying to figure out if there's a role for us to play there. So, A, it's amazingly interesting to go elsewhere and see what's happening. B, again, Newark is a global city, and we keep being exposed to these stories by who comes through Newark and who's there. And ultimately, one of the stories of this project, I think, hopefully, is the way that we're interconnected in all kinds of ways that we don't understand. We don't recognize, we don't acknowledge, and if we did, we wouldn't be so hasty to dismiss other parts of the world as insignificant or just political opportunities or problems.
See, it seems like it's the kind of work that you're doing, the way you're expanding in Colombia and Malta, it seems like there needs to be a kind of a more of an umbrella name than newest Americans. You know, do you have a kind of a more general name that would include these other?
Yeah, so we're really at a point where we're trying to figure out, because we didn't anticipate going outside the US. I mean, we didn't anticipate this happening. We've also sort of outgrown this idea of our only web presence being the magazine. We clearly need a more expansive website, because now we're developing curriculum from the media that we do, which again, I think long-term may have the most impact, because we can reach more people through the curriculum if it's adopted. So yeah, we're having all sorts of conversations about like whether we're going to continue to publish the magazine the way we do, or whether we're just going to publish work, you know, as it's ready, and have the website be something that's more capacious. We've also, the newest thing, I mean, part of what I love about the work is like, I get to live out all these fantasy careers. So I'm now, the latest thing we've done is music production. We have a Uruguayan student who is undocumented and is a dreamer, who is also a rapper. And he wrote this fantastic sort of anthem, a DACA anthem, which really isn't out there yet in the US. It's surprising, but there's no sort of, I mean, with all the sort of Hamilton stuff and Lin-Manuel Miranda and all of that, there's no real DACA anthem yet. And I think he may have written it. And he wrote this terrific, I mean, he's good, he's a good performer. But he, you know, he didn't have the money to make the music, so he just ripped a kind of generic reggaeton beat off of YouTube and popped it behind it, which he can't really put out, and threw it up on YouTube. He can't really distribute that widely because there's issues with copyright. It's also not very good music. And so I hooked him up with a former student of mine who's a fantastic musician and his partner in Los Angeles, and they wrote the music for it. I'm really excited because it's really good. It took us about a month to go back and forth on it. And we're about to shoot the music video December 1st and release that, hopefully, as another way to sort of get the word out and use the media to not only kind of put research out into the world, but to put art and advocacy and activism in as well. So, yeah, it's been an incredible pleasure for me working on this project, because it's every month there's sort of a new opportunity, and there seems to be a new interesting thing happening. I just found out today about this amazing project that's going on in Shatila. There's a group of young filmmakers, 20 young filmmakers that are being supported by a German group that I need to find more out about. I'm going to try and get out there tomorrow or Saturday. That it's called Campchi, and they're basically telling stories of the camp. And it's just all of these young people, sort of everything from like, you know, what happens with the garbage? Like, why is there all this garbage, and how come we have to live in garbage? To, you know, stories about the shoemaker who makes sure that everybody has shoes on their feet. I mean, like, just everyday stories. It seems like a brilliant project, and I'm blown away that there are a bunch of kids who are doing this. But these are the kinds of things that I think. Again, media is so critical, it seems to me, in any of these situations with refugees or migrants who are at risk in one way, shape, or form. That I don't have to tell you, but I mean, it's just critical that access to media, access to the skills, to the resources to tell one's own story is just so fundamental right now. Because if you can't tell your story, if you don't have the resources to tell your story, you don't exist. You know, and you don't have a shot at anybody paying attention. So. Do we want to watch the rest of this? Are we done? Are we happy to? It's time. What?
It's time.
It's time.
But
Yeah, we have one more question.
Yeah,
we
sure.
have one more question.
Absolutely.
We could take, and then of course people can
So
go and look at the media.
Yeah, I should just say, it's all available online. It's at newestamericans.com. There are brochures here too, where you can see sort of a little bit more of the range of stuff that we're doing. I should probably have mentioned, I thought we'd have more time to get to it, but we're also really interested in sort of digging deep into the local history of Newark, the immigration history, because another part of the project is that we're trying to make the case is that Newark is a city of immigrants and always has been, and that's been its strength, it's been its resources. And so we got a grant for the National Endowment for the Humanities to do a series of projects in neighborhoods where we're sort of digging deep into the history of buildings. Kind of, the whole story is buildings, blocks, and neighborhoods, right? But we're trying to get at a granular level, get down into the history rather than the sort of history from above, which tends to get told about cities like Newark. And we've been working with community groups. We've been hosting all sorts of history harvests, events with different community organizations, churches, mosques, to get people to come out and share their stories, but also share their material histories. What did you bring when you first came? What's the most important thing? What's the music that you came with? What was the... So we're really trying to sort of like dig down at a granular level to say, what is it that makes the experience of being displaced and the experience of creating a new life work or not work? Like what do you need to make a new life? The one thing I've been struck by, I've been doing this work now for 15 years of working in communities, and my argument is always like food is the most important thing. Like that's the first thing. Like nobody feels at home until they can figure out, you know, it depends on where you're from the Caribbean, until you can figure out where to buy breadfruit, you just don't feel like you're at home, right? Weather is critically important. Anybody from a warm climate who comes to New York or Newark or that area in the wintertime, it's a terrible, don't ever migrate in the winter if you're from a warm place, because it freaks you out. I mean, people still are like traumatized by the experience of like being that cold for the first time in their life. But things like that, like at a visceral level, at a granular level, what it really means.
Another question? And of course, Said here generally, Edward Said is very much associated with Orientalism, culture and imperialism. But you're talking about his less read and less acknowledged work on exile. He's one of the sort of most extraordinary theorists about the condition of exile, which is, you know, this kind of goes back to Horace's question or whatever. It's both an existential question, a transnational question, and it's, to a certain extent, the United States connecting with this experience that people all over the world have, which is what you're doing here. Is there something about that kind of theorizing or whatever that's particularly resonant with Said and exile, or just being around so many people who are, you know, in exile, at home and not at home, which is very much Said's kind of how it is. You're both at home and not. This, you know, sort of like Du Bois and the soul of black folks.
Yeah. So Robert's referring. I mean, there's our article of Said's that I teach a lot because it's just everybody who has been in exile anywhere, if they know this, they like have a copy of it. Like it's an incredibly powerful piece. One of the things that struck me when I first arrived at this campus.
So are we now?
In 2002, and this is a very short story, but it does answer your question a little bit obliquely. It was 2002 when I show up on this campus and I'm teaching a class. I have 23 students, and I'm teaching theater, so I need to know who's in the room. I need to know something about their background. We're going around the room, and it turns out that out of the 23 people, there's 17 languages spoken, and I'm blown away. I'm like, where? You know, I'm not in Kansas anymore. This is like, what's going on here? But the thing that was even more amazing than that was it's 2002, and there's a Bosnian, a Serb, and a Croat in the classroom. 2002, there's not a Bosnian, a Serb, and a Croat in any room anywhere else in the world, literally at that point. And the Serbian girl was very upset throughout the class, I could tell. She comes up to me at the end of the class and she says, I would very much like to take this class, but I can't. I said, really? Why? She said, because they hate me. I said, who hates you? She said, they. And she pointed to the Bosnian and the Croat. I said, really? And so I said, hey, I didn't know any of them. This is my first day teaching. And I'm not sure why I did this, because this could have backfired really bad. But I said, hey, can you come here? And I'm over. I said, do you hate her? She was like appalled. And they're looking like, what? Like, they didn't know anything. I'm like, no. And I turned to her and said, I don't think they hate you. And she's like, really flustered. Like, well, I mean, if they knew me, if they knew who I was, they hate me. Anyway, we managed to work it out, but I think only because I had done that. Because I think if I'd allowed her to just say, you know, I'm done, I'm walking away, by the end of the semester, the three of them worked on this project together. And the project was about exile. It was about what it was that they missed, what it was that they had lost in the war. And what they realized is they had more in common than anybody that they knew in the United States, because they had lost something together. The two girls actually discovered they had almost the same story, that their house had been destroyed, that they had fallen in love with an American somewhere in this process and had come here basically because of that. I believe, and as of like 5 years ago, which was the last time I saw them, they were like best friends, the four of them. They went out to dinner all the time, they took each other to the house. I think one of them, the Croatian girl had a baby, and I think the Serbian girl was her godmother type thing. I mean, really, it was like, because of course, they had the same experience. Not only were they exiles and they shared that experience, but they also knew what they were exiled from. And that sort of profound connection didn't matter ultimately that they were on the opposite side. If they could get past the fact that they didn't hate each other, it was the governments and the soldiers, but they didn't hate each other. They were both victims of this war, and they sort of realized that by the end of the semester. Wrote actually some beautiful, because this was a performance class, so they were writing sort of pieces that they would then perform. And everyone else in the class was sort of blown away by what they were doing, because, again, it was such a powerful connection. They had the same frame of reference, right? They knew everything about each other's lives, even though they didn't know each other, because they lived through the same war. So in that sense, I think part of, for them, that feeling of having found somebody who understood something that was not understandable, you know, was really, really potent. That's one of the things I think Said says in that essay, is that it's the loss of anybody who knows what you've been through, right? It's that loss of like, that sense that you will never have anybody to share this with, of being that alone, that is ultimately so horrifying. And they actually found that in that classroom.
Thanks. That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah,
thank you.